Good afternoon. My name is Isabel Rohr. I'm the manager of academic programs and outreach at JDC Archives. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar in the context of the Max and Cecile Stower-Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship. First, a quick word about JDC Archives. JDC Archives holds the records of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee since its creation about 108 years ago. Scholars from around the world, as well as family researchers, filmmakers, journalists, use our collections for their research. We also offer fellowships to enable scholars to conduct research in our archives. And today's webinar is organized in the context of the Max and Cecile Stower JDC Archives Fellowship. That fellowship was established in 2019 thanks to a generous gift from Dr. Sorrel Chassin and Lauren Chassin in honor of the parents of Sorrel Chassin. Sorrel and Lauren Chassin are supporters of JDC who have deep roots in the field of higher education, as well as a long-term commitment to academic research and scholarship. I want to extend on behalf of JDC Archives our thanks to Sorrel and Lauren Chassin who are with us today for endowing this fellowship. In fact, I would like to call on Sorrel Chassin, who will introduce our speaker today, Ethell Gershengorin, who is the recipient of the Max and Cecile Stower Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship for 2022. After this introduction, Ethell will talk for about 45 minutes. We will then entertain questions. Please note that your microphones are muted and you can send us questions via the Q&A function on Zoom. And you can send us questions at any time during the lecture. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. Sorrel will now introduce Ethell Gershengorin.
I'm pleased to say that Ethell Gershengorin is a doctoral candidate at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, specialized in Imperial Russian and Soviet history. Specifically, she works in the fields of gender and women's history, material culture, and Jewish studies. She received her bachelor's degree in international relations from Boston University and her master's in history from the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Her master's thesis examined the centrality of the peasant woman to Soviet and anti-religious campaigns. This year, Ethell is conducting research at the Center for Jewish History and the JDC Archives on her dissertation with the working title of Healthy Bodies, Upright Citizens, the OZE, Jewish Women and Children and Interwar Medical Humanitarianism from 1914 to 1939. Her research traces medical aid directed toward Jewish women and children in interwar Eastern Europe. She received numerous fellowships and awards for her academic achievements, including the Cohn-Tucker Dissertation Research Fellowship, the Rifkin Graduate Research Fellowship, the Silas Palmer Grant, and of course, the Max and Cecile Stower-Chassin JDC Archives Fellowship, which I established a few years ago. And some of the speakers came from all over the world. They applied and some of them received the fellowship. And now I ask her to start her lecture.
Thank you so much, Sorrel, for that introduction. I'm very grateful to be able to carry on the memory of your parents with this fellowship. Let me just quickly share my screen. I'd also like to thank Isabel for all of her support throughout this process of my research at JDC, and also thank you to Abra Cohen for technical support for this webinar. So first, I'd like to say that all of the images on this talk were taken from the JDC archives, and I was really excited to work with them. There's a really rich collection of images photographed in the Joint archives. And I'd also like to give a bit of a disclaimer before the talk. I'll be talking about a lot of figures, and there'll be a lot of repeating names. And while the JDC workers themselves are very important, what I want you to really focus on this talk is the things that they said about their work. A representative of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, the JDC, or Joint for short, Lieutenant Sheehan, arrived on July 27, 1919, to Zwiagel, a city in the historic region of Volhynia that encompassed today's southeastern Poland, southwestern Belarus, and western Ukraine. Sheehan painted the following scene, quote, "The persons in charge of the relief work found in some homes pictures full of horror. They found mothers sick with typhus or dysentery and attended to by their children. In other instances, they found in the bed of a mother sick with typhus the body of a child that died from the same disease. Those whom they were meeting in the streets were mysterious wandering shadows rather than people. All were starved and barefoot, piles of corpses. There were over 2,000 waiting for their turn to be buried in a state of decomposition, were causing an even further spread of contagious diseases," end quote. Unfortunately, these conditions were not unique to pogrom-torn Zwiagel or to the entire region of Volhynia, but were found across the expansive ruins of the Russian Empire after World War I. My focus in today's talk will be on the Joint's post-war reconstruction work from 1919 to 1929 in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, and Soviet Russia, particularly in the realm of childcare. I will discuss how the JDC's concerns about the future of Eastern European children fostered a particular dynamic between JDC workers on the ground and their Eastern European Jewish colleagues and recipients of aid. What I found in the rich collection of sources at the JDC's archives is that a crucial facet of the Joint's childcare work, expressed in their programs and in their dynamics with local workers, was the desire to, quote, enlighten Eastern European Jews on proper childcare and to transform Eastern European Jewish children into self-sufficient members of a post-war society. The Joint was founded during World War I and acted as an umbrella relief organization, eventually consolidating into an organization in its own right. And it distributed aid to Jews affected by the war worldwide. It emerged out of the New York philanthropic scene, bringing together various groups, from elite uptown Jews and socially and economically mobile downtown Jews to middle-class Jewish social workers. Due to its diversity, the Joint remained nonpartisan and seemingly apolitical. At the helm of the organization was upper and middle-class Jews who were steeped in the thinking and activism of American progressivism. In America, Jewish social workers sought to tackle what they saw as social evils connected to mass immigration, urbanization, industrialization, urban unrest, and the spread of diseases. The lives of Eastern European Jews who immigrated to America starting in the 1880s in many ways embodied these social evils and at the same time threatened the status acculturated Jews had reached in America up to that point. To reform these so-called backward Eastern European Jewish immigrants, American Jewish social workers created aid programs that mobilized ideas about proper forms of cleanliness, nutrition, education, and social hygiene, all of which were intimately intertwined. Moreover, JDC workers lived and worked in a time where ideas of racial science and social Darwinism reigned large, and nations were believed to sit on an imagined hierarchy from backward to civilized. Thus, it was from this prevailing intellectual context that members of the Joint engaged in its aid missions in Eastern Europe during and after World War I. It was from this perspective, mixed with genuine altruism and genuine solidarity with their co-religionists, that the determination to reform Eastern European Jews can be best understood. Caring for children and raising them to be civilized members of society was an incredibly crucial component of this project of reform that Joint workers brought to Eastern Europe. Understood as constituting a single group, the Jewish people's health was the aggregate of the health of its individual members. Within this framework, the proper development of children and youth, something imperiled by the effects of industrialized urban society, let alone war and pogroms, was a crucial factor for the future strength and progress of the Jewish community. Efforts to ensure the feeding, health, hygiene, and education of Jewish children, crucial components of a correct early development, were thus key to the activity of the Joint in their quest to uplift their Eastern co-religionists. Compounding these concerns about transforming Eastern European Jewish children was the fear of what their potential maldevelopment might mean for the civilizational status of American Jews and Jews more broadly, in the eyes of potential anti-Semites, especially. This was not dissimilar to the way uptown New York Jewish people worried about how working class Jews of the Lower East Side might impact their status by association. A crucial part of being civilized was having respect from other civilized peoples, something that rampant anti-Semitism hampered. This translated into a desire to make these children into upright and self-sufficient citizens to pacify anti-Semitism. Therefore, not only was aiding children deemed so crucial because they were the most helpless of all victims, but also because dreams of future progress and fears of anti-Semitism were pinned to their healthy development. What I will argue in this talk is that transforming Jewish children through aid, be it medical or economic, was key to visions of pulling Jews up along the civilizational hierarchy. When we see the Joint's relief work in this way, humanitarian aid becomes a political endeavor because of these larger implications. There was more at stake in this situation than simply aiding the needy. And the stakes were even higher for children as the problems of the post-war moment were projected onto the children and the progress they could bring or fail to bring for the future Jewish community. My interest in the JDC's monumental childcare work and reconstruction work in Eastern Europe after the war actually originates with the people and organizations that received funding from and collaborated with the Joint on the ground. I'm writing a dissertation on one of these partner organizations called the Society for the Preservation of the Health of the Jewish Population, known by its Russian language acronym, the OZE. Not only did the Joint and the OZE work together, but both organizations were part of a mass movement of Jews in the early 20th century seeking to take control of their own healthcare. Whether we look at Zionist organizations like Hadassah providing healthcare to Jews in Palestine, health clinics set up by garment unions in America, or Bundessanatoria in Poland, Jews understood health as a crucial frontier for preserving and, when necessary, reconstructing the Jewish community during this time. My dissertation seeks to understand the importance of childcare and women's health to the OZE's project of regenerating a war-torn, destitute, and disease-ridden Jewish community. To give just a brief overview of the OZE, it was an organization established by Jewish doctors in St. Petersburg in 1912 still under the rule of the Russian Empire. Many of these doctors studied medicine in Western Europe and subscribed to and preached the prevailing ideas of science and social hygiene in Western Europe and America. These doctors intended to take control of and transform the collective social body of the Jewish nation by treating individual Jewish bodies. In other words, leaders of the OZE saw medicine and social hygiene as the way to unite a fractured Jewish people and attain self-governance within a regime that denied Jews political autonomy. After the collapse of the Russian Empire, the OZE restored and built locations within newly established Eastern European states, often with the financial assistance of the Joint. My project will ultimately answer how the OZE, often with the help of the Joint, sought to transform the Jewish masses through medicine and hygiene, and how the health of Jewish women and children served as focal points of visions for a Jewish future in Eastern Europe. I will continue to research these questions in Latvian and Israeli archives over the next year and a half. Similar to many historians of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union, I was supposed to be doing research in Russia as we speak, and I still do not know when or if I will be able to travel to Russia. And the irony is not lost on me that the very region I study, a region that took decades to reconstruct after both world wars, is again entrapped in a vicious war of aggression whose escalation is about to enter its second year. So, how did we get here? To start off, I'd like to give a bit of context to the talk and explain what kind of situation these JDC workers entered. The Jews most significantly impacted by the war were those that lived closest to Imperial Russia's border with Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These Jews lived in the western regions of the Pale of Settlement, an area that Jews were legally restricted to live and work in. At the start of the war, the Russian Imperial Army, distrusting of Jews and their loyalty to the Russian war cause, embarked on a massive and often bloody campaign to deport Jews eastward further into the Russian Empire. Historian Eric Lohr estimates that between 500,000 and 1 million Jews were forced out of their homes, making it one of the largest cases of forced migration up to World War II. Dispossessed of their homes and livelihoods, Jews were often left destitute, vulnerable to the spread of diseases, and relying on the aid of unfamiliar Jewish communities that themselves were struggling to survive. This situation was exacerbated by the Bolshevik takeover of power and ensuing Russian Civil War. Anti-Semitism and false ideas about the inherent disposition of Jews to Bolshevism spurred a series of militarized pogroms perpetrated by both the Red and White armies, which left tens of thousands of children orphaned. Hence, it is without exaggeration that both Jews in Eastern Europe and abroad feared for the safety and future of the largest Jewish community in the world at the time. From the beginning of the war until the end in 1919, which coincided with the height of the Russian Civil War pogroms, the JDC could only help from afar, and American donations were distributed by local Jewish organizations and relief workers. But starting in the spring of 1919, JDC social workers were able to go on missions to assess the devastation and needs of Eastern European Jewish communities. These missions would be the first time American Jews would witness the devastation of these communities and form their opinions on the needs and abilities of the population they set out to aid. And it was the suffering of children in particular through which joint workers experienced and understood the gravity of the devastation they witnessed. Even before joint workers set up their childcare operations on the ground, their work in Eastern Europe was always understood to be temporary. One of the main tasks of JDC representatives abroad was stimulating local Jews to help themselves so as to avoid the quote, demoralization which would follow excessive dependence on America, end quote. And as we'll now see, the joint's constant foreshadowing of its liquidation from the region deeply impacted how they ran childcare programs and cooperated with local aid workers. Broadly speaking, their childcare work could be separated into the four following categories: registration of orphans, sending and distributing supplies, giving subsidies to existing institutions, and what I would call enlightenment or transformative programs. One of the first courses of action taken by joint social workers was recording the orphans in a given city or town. Jacques Rieur, the JDC's director of Congress Poland in 1920, sought to, quote, clear the streets of Warsaw City of Jewish beggar children, end quote. To do this, he began by choosing 10 children at random who ranged in age between 4 and 12 years, took an individual history of each child, took their photograph, had them examined by a physician, and arranged their placement in an orphans asylum in the city of Radom. For joint workers like Rieur, registering homeless orphans, taking them off the street and putting them through these examination processes and into what they deemed proper institutions was crucial for their larger project of civilizing these children. Registering the children was not only important for the distribution of aid, but also for fundraising efforts back in America. The joint had to stay accountable to their American donors for the work they were doing and communicate the civilizing project back to the Jews funding it. One of the joint's fundraising tactics was financial adoption, a program where American Jews could donate money to the JDC for the care of a specific child or multiple children. These funds supplemented the general donations sent to JDC-sponsored institutions. Sharing names and photographs of needy children certainly facilitated the program, as American Jews could feel a personal connection to the child or children that they financially supported. And on the other side of this process, children and local communities, or kehilot, felt optimistic about the potential for aid during registration. For example, joint workers in Riga, Latvia, expressed that, quote, the registration and photographing of the orphans has advanced great hopes among the children and the kehilas, and often we are asked when our work will begin, end quote. Once joint workers registered children and assessed their needs, supplies were either sent from America, from the joint's European office, or purchased locally. These supplies ranged from food to clothing, shoes, and bedding, as well as medical equipment and medicine. As a historian who's interested in material culture and the importance of objects in narrating history, I'm particularly concerned with what these supplies can tell us about the relationship between American Jewish donors and Eastern European Jewish recipients. For example, in Lithuania, Joseph Marcus, JDC's administrator for Lithuania, discussed the purchasing and distribution logistics of summer clothing for Jewish children in January of 1923 with Dr. Berger, the head of the locally staffed child care committee. Marcus rejected Berger's request to send a representative of this child care committee to Berlin to determine what type of clothing Jewish children received in JDC's Berlin institution. In this situation, Berger was clearly making a statement about where Lithuania sat in an imagined hierarchy of nations and JDC priorities. His desire to dress Lithuanian children in similar garb as German children spoke to his need for Lithuanians and their children to be given the same type of respect and aid that a Western European nation and its people would receive. It is unclear if the summer clothes for Lithuanian orphans matched those of children in Berlin. However, we do know that some Eastern European social workers, like Berger, pushed back on the expectation that Eastern European Jews had to be unduly grateful with whatever type of aid they received. We see here a dynamic where both the joint social workers and their local partners vied for control over aid operations. Though the joint came with money, and in their understanding more expertise, local aid workers also saw this as their terrain and their children to care for. Moreover, this conflict shows us how supplies in and of themselves held certain meanings, could sit within a constructed hierarchy, and serve as points of friction in aid. Though the joint was invested in enacting sweeping changes, it was cognizant of the temporary nature of its mission. Thus, it gave subsidies to existing childcare institutions with the hope that as its reconstruction work continued, local Jewish communities would eventually have to take over the entirety of the funding. Joint funds went to orphanages, feeding stations, the construction of bathhouses for children, hospitals for babies, sanatoria for children sick with tuberculosis, children's summer colonies, and milk consultations for infants. These institutions were met with both praise and criticism in JDC reports and correspondence. The joint expressed its satisfaction, particularly with how local Jews set up and ran children's summer colonies. In a report on activities in Lithuania, Dr. Julius Muscat, director of the JDC in Lithuania, wrote of 2 summer colonies that, quote, carried on their work efficiently. And he saw that, quote, children were really being cared for in the right way, end quote. However, the joint did not shower praise on all the institutions it supported. When speaking of children's homes in Soviet Petrograd or internats, David Brown, the national chairman of the joint fundraising campaign, perceived them as far from modern. He went on to say that, quote, we must not forget that these people were never on par with our methods, and that while we may hope that the future will bring them up to our standards, it is necessary to work with the conditions we find today, end quote. Thus, among the praise, it is not uncommon to find criticisms of local institutions falling behind what the joint perceived of as modern and thus up to their standards. The joint's praise and criticism of the institutions speak to an ambivalence they felt toward local aid workers, something we'll discuss later on, while also showing the joint's pragmatism. They believed it was better to house children in institutions that weren't up to their standards rather than have them live like animals on the street. The last type of childcare activity I'll detail are programs established by JDC workers that were specifically intended to transform Eastern European Jews to ensure the joint's easy transition out of the region. As I've previously mentioned, the joint work was supposed to be temporary from its very inception, and to be able to pull out of the region, the joint heavily relied on self-help programs within its childcare work. These programs were intended to make child caretakers self-sufficient, to enlighten local Jews about the importance of caring for orphans, and to shape the children themselves into upright individuals. In Latvia, the JDC created a program in 1923 where they gave loans to 48 widows, war widows, which would be used by these women to purchase the necessary equipment to start working and making money to provide for their children. The War Widows program was inherently a self-help initiative as the women were required to sign a promissory note to repay the loan in interest-free installments. This was not a handout, and it was created to ensure Jewish mothers could provide for their own children, and the joint could start liquidating its operations in earnest. In a letter to the Committee on War Orphans in New York, Dr. Bernard Kahn, acting chairman of the JDC European Executive Council, praised the success of this experiment and encouraged that it be set up in other countries. He hoped that by aiding war widows, the JDC could try to diminish the number of children in its subvention budget and, quote, in this way, eventually be able to exclude children who might otherwise be our charges for some time to come, end quote. Kahn concludes his letter by saying that, quote, in this way, we hope to more readily and rationally liquidate the childcare work when the time comes to close our activity, end quote. JDC workers often questioned how local communities cared for orphans. When it came to questions of quality of care, the JDC often described Eastern Europeans as too backward to raise their own children, whether they were talking about their parents or their caretakers. For example, in a report written about her travels around war-torn Latvia, Deborah Margolis described, quote, a great deal of poverty and children that are brought up by very unintelligent mothers or relations, end quote. At first, the JDC responded to what they deemed neglectful caretaking of Eastern European Jewish children by taking responsibility for them. However, as time went on, the JDC's priorities shifted to liquidating their work in Eastern Europe, and JDC workers expressed frustration over bearing the lion's share of the work and financing for orphans. In a letter written on February 15th, 1923, Joseph Marcus informed Dr. Berger that, quote, the committees must be made to understand that the child care problem of their communities is their problem and not ours. We merely wish to come to their assistance and care for the orphans created by the war. And it is not just to expect the American Jews to pay to the committees for the privilege of helping them, end quote. A few months later, Marcus sent another letter, more optimistic and revealing of his mission in childcare. In it, he wrote, quote, I feel that the Joint Distribution Committee has made a lasting contribution to the Lithuanian Jews by starting and carrying orphan work to this date. We have contributed not only money, we have aroused the public interest in the welfare of their orphans. From a slumbering crowd, we have made an active, result-bearing body of people who have become imbued with the interests of the orphans in whose behalf we started this work, end quote. In other words, the Joint had successfully enlightened Eastern European Jews on the importance of taking care of orphans. To circumvent a situation where Eastern European Jews perpetually depended on American Jewish philanthropy, the Child Care Department considered it a vital task to make the orphans under its care self-supporting. To do this, members of the Child Care Department worked with the Reconstruction Department, as the latter was responsible for developing trade schools and workshops where children were taught technical skills like tailoring, metalworking, and needlework. In Riga, Abraham Schoen, JDC's childcare director in Vienna, argued for the JDC to shift its preferences to caring for children between the ages of 11 and 13, so that when they plan to liquidate operations in 3 years, the children will be self-supporting and won't suffer as much when they are dropped. He hoped that this would, quote, make a more substantial contribution because of the opportunities this will afford to us to give a larger number of children trade training, thereby preparing them for productive citizenship. When describing trade schools in Warsaw at the meeting of the Constructive Relief Conference, Herbert H. Lehman, vice chairman of JDC's Reconstruction Committee, praised these schools for, quote, "They were really the means of developing the child life to the end that these children can grow up into being useful men and women," end quote. In fact, the JDC was so proud of their efforts to make Eastern European Jewish children productive that they created a trade exhibition in 1927 with products of craftsmanship and industrial art made by the children educated in their trade schools and workshops. And here on the screen, you can see an example of this exhibit. This exhibit traveled throughout the US to showcase the JDC's mission of, quote, modern social childcare. Starting in 1928, vocational training became the primary focus of the JDC's childcare work in Eastern Europe, as it discontinued giving subsidies for the maintenance of orphanages and other childcare institutions. The JDC began excluding care of half orphans or children who had one living parent and preschool or school-age children to devote their attention to children pursuing trade courses, children brought to the larger cities from the provinces for educational or vocational training, and full orphans. All of these examples point to the joint's belief that teaching children to be self-sufficient will not only ensure that they won't be dependent on American Jewish aid, like their parents, but that these children will become civilized in the process. To uplift children into proper citizens, the joint needed competent partners on the ground that shared their vision. Looking through JDC's archives, I found the relationship between JDC workers and their Eastern European partners in the realm of childcare to be quite ambivalent. At times, JDC workers valued their colleagues on the ground, and at others, they portrayed Eastern European Jewish aid workers as greedy and incompetent. But let's start off with the positive. In a 1922 letter from Dr. Irvin Michelin, JDC's assistant director of the medico-sanitary department in Europe, to his boss Morris Waldman, the director of the medico-sanitary department, Michelin praised Dr. Lehman, an OZE doctor, calling him, quote, "a competent child welfare worker and executive," end quote. Lehman served as the director of the Health and Educational Center for Children in Kovno and supervised over the entire childcare work in Lithuania. In another letter correspondence between Joseph Marcus and Joseph Hyman, the joint administrator in Latvia and Lithuania, Marcus felt confident in Lehman and his OZE colleague, Dr. Gurvich's abilities, calling Gurvich a gentleman and expressing faith in Lehman's medical advice and organizational ability. Lastly, in a report created by David Bressler, a JDC representative who held many positions, including the head of the Refugee Committee in New York, and Joseph Hyman, on the conditions of Jews in Eastern Europe in 1929, OZE and its affiliate TOZ in Poland received ample approval from JDC. Quote, "More than 31,000 school children in Poland are under TOZ's care. It is continuing the campaign against FAVIS, which the JDC initiated. And FAVIS was a very common fungal infection found on children's scalps." The report continues, "Its summer colony work is noteworthy. We visited TOZ institutions and offices in various cities in Poland and believe it is rendering excellent measure of service," end quote. Based on my research, I believe that the joint respected the OZE and TOZ because they aligned with the joint's perspective on transforming Jewish children through medicine and social hygiene. There was a lot of overlap between the goals and projects of the joint and the OZE/TOZ. And without their synergy on the ground with local organizations, the joint could not have accomplished as much as it did, and vice versa. These examples, though congratulatory of the work carried out by Eastern European Jews, was often overshadowed by negative assessments of local aid workers. It turned out that not only did the destitute Eastern European Jews need uplifting, but so did the aid workers, according to internal joint documents. A common trope found in JDC correspondence was the belief that Eastern European Jews were simply taking funds without actually doing any reconstructive childcare work. Joseph Marcus wrote a letter on February 16, 1923 to Abraham Schoen, expressing frustration over what he saw was an abject misuse of funds by Dr. Berger. Marcus got word from a JDC instructor by the name of Mr. Volk, who he sent to Jonava, a city in central Lithuania, that the orphans there had not all been registered, an important condition for both donation distribution and fundraising, as we've discussed. In response, Marcus complained that Berger had, quote, not the slightest conception of business management, end quote. Then, widening his net to include people in Berger's orbit, and potentially all Eastern European Jews, Marcus stated, quote, let us have money and lots of it. That is their slogan. Efficient distribution, well, that is not important, end quote. Here, Marcus is not only denigrating his on-the-ground colleague for misuse of JDC funds, but also for sheer greediness. Whether Berger was in fact mishandling JDC funds is less the point. What is important is how Marcus used his frustration with Berger to paint a broader picture of Eastern European Jewish over-reliance and misuse of American Jewish money. Intimately tied to the view that Eastern European Jewry was either asking too much of American Jews or misusing American dollars was the JDC social workers' perception of the people they aided and worked with as backward, incompetent, and needing supervision. JDC workers like Joseph Marcus in Lithuania believed their beneficiaries and partners on the ground to be incompetent. In a March 1923 letter to Abraham Schoen, Marcus recounts his motorcycle trip where he visited several small Lithuanian towns. According to Marcus, these towns, I quote, these towns were practically without any intellectual forces to reckon with. They are backward in every sense of the word, end quote. His proposed solution would be to, quote, bring a few more or less intelligent people to these towns, end quote. In a separate point, Marcus praised the JDC instructor, Mr. Volk, who I mentioned previously, one he calls our man, who has, quote, set the machinery right at work, end quote. Thus, we see a dichotomy created by certain JDC officials between American social workers, or those who follow and align with American conceptions of intellectual, i.e. modern, workers, and Eastern Europeans. An interesting way JDC workers express their views of Eastern European Jews as less modern and capable of rebuilding devastated Jewish communities was through the language of hygiene. In a report on his travels through Soviet Russia, David Brown expressed his disgust with how people lived. Quote, dirt and filth and dirt is the order of the day, end quote. He described 100 or more old women, dirty through lack of soap and water and covered with vermin. In another example, the JDC director of Congress Poland, Isaac Rubinstein, revealed his feelings of hygienic and moral superiority when arguing with the Lodz Committee. According to Rubinstein, the Lodz Committee complained that the JDC was not treating them as fairly as the JDC in Warsaw and asked for more money per child to run their summer colonies. Rubinstein made it clear to the committee that they should not expect the JDC to pay the entire bill for the summer colonies, and that they should make an effort to collect part of the money from their own people in Lodz. Instead of complaining against the JDC, Rubinstein stated, they better sweep their own houses. This outburst shows that JDC workers not only perceive their recipients of aid as unhygienic and thus less cultured and civilized, but they had the same feelings toward their colleagues. More so, because Rubinstein made this statement in response to the fact that he believed the Lodz Committee was failing their children, being unclean took on a more serious and moral significance. And to be clear, the JDC saw a progression over time when it came to how Eastern European Jews measured up to their, meaning American, standards, but also seeing a quote evolution among the local population is quite revealing of the goals and expectations of the joint workers. JDC workers not only had incredibly challenging circumstances to overcome in their reconstruction missions, but their aid also came with a lot of baggage. And these difficulties on the ground, compounded with tensions between joint workers and their local colleagues and aid recipients. Ultimately, this translated into a desire to transform Eastern European Jews, especially children. Having explored the JDC's childcare work and the successes and tensions between JDC workers and their colleagues in childcare, we can recap the arguments made in this talk. First, throughout its childcare work, the joint remained nonpartisan and focused on supplying the bare necessities to the most devastated children. However, we can still see through the way joint workers talked about Eastern European Jews and the way they organized their aid, that the joint had an underlying mission to transform and civilize Eastern European Jews and their children. We can see what many scholars have shown before, that despite claiming to be apolitical, there was still a politics to the joint's activity. And this politics was grounded in a view of civilizational hierarchies and development. Second, a crucial component of believing and implementing notions of what it meant to be civilized was the joint's politics of fighting anti-Semitism through its transformation of Eastern European Jews. Historian Jacqueline Granick argues similarly in her book that beneath all of the joint's operations was a fear of stoking anti-Semitism and a desire to mitigate it. Considering the context these joint workers found themselves in, which were the literal ruins of Jewish communities devastated by anti-Semitic expulsions and pogroms, it's not surprising that their visions for transforming Jews were grounded in diminishing anti-Semitism. The last takeaway is that children were central to the joint's initiatives of raising upright citizens and fighting anti-Semitism. More important for my larger research question is that the joint's vision to transform Eastern European Jewry through its children aligned with the goals of the OCE. Thanks to the generous funding of the Max and Cecil Stoyer-Chesson Fellowship and the rich archives of the JDC, we see children as fundamental to transnational Jewish efforts of remaking the world's largest population of Jews, one that just survived unprecedented violence and facing an uncertain political future. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ethell, for this fascinating lecture. We'll now open the floor to questions. Please remember that your microphones are muted. You can send us questions via the Q&A function. And Ethell, I see that we already have some questions for you.
Great.
I will start with a very light question. That's more, I guess, a personal question, not too personal. Someone wants to know how many languages do you speak to be able to conduct this research?
So Russian is my heritage language, and I can read quite well in Yiddish. My speaking abilities are not that great. And Hebrew is not too relevant to this project. Mainly, my dissertation leans a lot on Yiddish. A lot of the sources are in Yiddish, yeah.
Including sources in the JDC archives, have you?
The JDC archives, yes, the JDC archives, the sources I work with there are mostly in English. There's some Yiddish sources there, but they had English translation.
Okay, so I'll ask you another question. Did the JDC interact with the American Jewish Committee, the Jewish Welfare Board, and Herbert Hoover's American Relief Administration in aid to Jews in Eastern Europe?
Absolutely. So when I mentioned earlier that the joint functioned as an umbrella organization, it worked with a lot of the American Jewish organizations back home. And then, yes, when it came to aid, particularly in Russia, the joint worked through the ARA, the American Relief Administration, that was set up by Hoover. And it was thanks to the ARA that the JDC was able to enter Soviet Russia in certain areas that wouldn't be accessible to them at the time. And I'd also like to mention that if it wasn't for the JDC, the OZE would not be able to operate in Soviet Russia during certain years. So there's a lot of like organizational, not only cooperation, but like heavy reliance on one another.
Someone, and I think we have two related questions. I think someone wants to know where the effort's successful, and someone else asked what happened to the orphans. So I think these are somewhat related.
Sure. So their efforts, it depends on how we want to measure success. If we're measuring the success of the transformative project that I spoke of, there were certainly a lot of Jewish children that went through vocational training. But, it's hard to have kind of like a measuring tool of did they become civilized? That's a bit difficult to measure. But the JDC was very successful in housing children, feeding children, clothing children. And they did a lot of really incredible work considering the circumstances on the ground. And this is a bit of a struggle in my project, is that I'm researching from the perspective of the joint and the OZE. So the organizations that are implementing these programs and that the organizations that have these visions. And I have yet to come across a treasure trove of sources that tell me how these programs were received and how children experience living in these orphanages and going through these programs. And that's something that I'm still on the hunt for. And so I guess the answer is it's a bit complicated, but the joint was certainly successful in giving bare necessities to children in need, absolutely.
And I mean, related to both the question that was asked about the future of the children and the fact that, you cannot find out what happened to them. Someone wrote a question, but it's more a remark. It's, do you feel an overwhelming sorrow that these are the very children who will be killed in the Holocaust? So it's many of those children, unfortunately, perished a few years later.
Absolutely. It not only, yes, the children were most likely, a lot of them had perished in the Holocaust, and as well as the actors that I study within the OZE, a lot of them ended up in Jewish ghettos and did not survive the Holocaust. And so it is very difficult to research with that in mind. However, as historians of Jews in Eastern Europe in the interwar period, a lot of the times were pushed, might not be the right word, but were challenged to not look at history backwards, meaning we're challenged to not conduct research knowing that the Holocaust is coming ahead. And so that's a goal of my research, is to look at the ODE and their projects and their programs and their goals and desires is something that they thought was really going to be achieved, despite the fact that I know, yes, a lot of these children and the people that I study perished.
Someone would like to know if there were actually, again, related questions. So someone wants to know if there was any adoption by American Jews, and someone else wants to know, another participant wants to know if there were any possibilities of immigration to the US, and if the joint could help with the immigration during that time.
Yeah, so immigration and adoption were quite tricky and complicated issues for the joint. The joint, its number one goal and priority was to help Jews where they lived and where in the situation that they were in. And they did not have like a formal and strong adoption program. However, at times that received a lot of criticism from the American public. And so they helped at certain times with adoption, but that wasn't their number one priority. And so that's why I focused specifically on, and mainly on this reconstruction work, because that was what the joint really pushed for. And they tried their best not to pull Jewish children out of Eastern Europe and send them to America or Palestine or Canada. But there were, of course, lots of adoptions that happened, just not under the leadership of the joint.
A participant would like to know, actually, again, it's interesting. The questions are coming together and they're related. A little bit more about the relationship between the authorities in the recipient countries and the joint. So how the local governments was receiving the joint, it's the same question, how the interaction between the authorities and the joint workers, if you've come across this in your research.
Yeah, this, it depended by place. So for example, in Soviet Russia, in a lot of the countries that I study, there's an acceptance and a willingness for the governments to bring in aid because they needed aid, that they needed to help their citizens and the people living within these newly created borders. And so they welcomed aid. However, for example, in the case of Soviet Russia, the Bolshevik really pushed to make sure that the JDC wasn't only aiding Jews. And so that's kind of where the joints work with the American Relief Administration was so key and crucial in Soviet Russia, because they didn't have, the joint promised the Bolsheviks that they would not have programs specifically targeting Jews, but yet they were in regions where a majority of Jewish children or Jews in general lived. And so while there was mostly acceptance and want of the joint help, there was certainly tension. And I found the tensions to be particularly evident in the Soviet Union, because you have this ideological factor as well at play.
How does the role of the agro joint fit into your research? Does it? Yeah, if you could talk a little bit and maybe say something about the agro joint, because I'm not sure everybody on the call knows what.
Sure. So the Agro Joint was an initiative and a program started by the Joint that was in mainly the Ukrainian regions of the Soviet Union that aimed to spur and facilitate Jewish agricultural colonies. And that is something that I am just starting to think about, of how much of a role that will have in my project, because the OZE, since I'm focused specifically on the OZE didn't have agricultural work programs, but I am curious, and I will be researching whether OZE doctors went on to work on these agricultural colonies, because I do know that they had clinics for children and nurseries, and they had health services there. And so I am curious about the connection between the OZE and the Agro Joint, but so far it's mainly a peripheral part of my project.
And I think I will ask you one more question, Ethell.
Sure.
Were these children generally religious? Did they and their families practice Judaism in any form? Is this something you also know from your research?
There was a wide range. And at this point, because of the destruction that occurred during World War I and the Civil War pogroms, practicing Judaism became very difficult to many. And so when the decision came between observing the Sabbath, Shabbat, or working and providing for one's family, Jews opted for the latter. And so that's certainly a question that I have, is the level of religiosity that these Jews had during this time. But that's certainly, when we look at schools in particular, there were, throughout Eastern Europe, there were Jewish private schools that were religious and secular, and the Joint sponsored both. And so really you have a range of religiosity. But I'm hoping to answer, within the population, within the most destitute, how religious were these Jews? And I think a big question that will remain, if I don't find this treasure trove of sources from the children's perspective, is how religious the children consider themselves. But yeah.
Someone just wrote to thank you and to tell you that your research is illuminating and that they learned a lot. So I think I want to thank you as well, Ethell. I think we all have learned a lot from your presentation. I also would like to thank our participants for joining us today. The next JDC Archives program will take place on March 29. Dr. Michael Rome, recipient of the 2022 Nathan and Sarah Chessing JDC Archives Fellowship, will give a lecture on Egyptian Jewish immigration to Brazil between 1956 and 1961. Invitations will be sent out on March 8th, and you should also be able to register via JDC Archives Facebook, as well as the link that is in the chat. And we hope that many of you will be able to join us. Please sign up for our e-newsletter if you'd like to receive invitations to our other public programs. Thank you, everyone.